Well, friends and neighbors, we've arrived at another Books vs. Movies review tiebreaker. Hatters' review in the last episode made the score 9-9, and so to see who's going to be the first to reach a 2-digit score, let's take a look at Lewis Carroll. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a lot of children's literature was written that shaped not just children's literature, but our culture in general. It's hard to say whether novels like Wizard of Oz, Peter Pan, and The Secret Garden were influenced by this novel, but Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, published in 1865, predates them all. This piece of nonsensical literature, made up of stories told to entertain three sisters, has become an iconic piece of literature and culture. Phrases like down the rabbit hole, the Cheshire Cat, and the Mad Tea Party have become common allusions for stories in the past century. And in 1871, Carroll published another Alice story, Through the Looking Glass, which, though perhaps not as well known or popular as the first novel, still has a number of iconic elements and characters. These two stories, usually smooshed together, have inspired a number of visual adaptations in several different genres. Stage plays, musicals, silent movies, animations, television shows, and miniseries, modernizations, to say nothing of the myriad references made in other stories. And while these visual adaptations are each interesting in their own way, only one really stands out in our collective human consciousness. That, of course, is the Disney animated version from 1951, starring the vocal talent of Catherine Beaumont and Ed Wynn. Like most visual adaptations, this story sticks to the basic framework of the Wonderland story, but incorporates several elements of the Looking Glass story as well. However, unlike most visual adaptations, this story has a number of iconic elements of its own, making it stand out both as a classic Disney film and as a memorable adaptation of the story. But is it better than Carroll's well-known works of nonsense? Let's find out. This is Books vs. Movies review of Alice in Wonderland. Fittingly, we begin by looking at our main character, Alice. Alice is another one of these generic protagonists whose main purpose is basically just to exist in this weird, zany world and kind of act as a liaison between the readers in the real world and the fictional characters in the bizarre world. Alice basically has two defining characteristics. She's imaginative and she's curious. And both of these characteristics make her perfectly suited to lead us into this bizarre world of, well, wonders. She's also very proper in many ways, but very childish in others. You can tell that she has upbringing, but her curiosity and imaginative nature often get the better of her. To use an apt description from the book, she gives herself very good advice, but she very seldom follows it. This trait was such an apt description of Alice that it actually got its own song in the movie.
I give myself very good advice, but I very seldom follow it.
And as it happens, this character trait was, in general, made more of here. This became the main mode of development for Alice. Her curiosity gets her into trouble, and at a certain point she just breaks down and wonders plaintively if she'll ever learn.
Will I ever learn to do the things I should?
Of course, as it happens, we never actually find out if she ever learns, so it's not much development to be sure, but it's still more than what we get in the book. Additionally, Alice does seem to have a bit more personality in the movie. She goes through a lot of emotions in the course of a narrative, and in general it seems like she has more that kids can relate with. But this isn't really a character-driven novel, and the point of Alice is not really that she change, but that she stay exactly the way she is. I mean, she's painted in a pretty objective light, sometimes good and sometimes not, but the point of Alice in the end is that she's driven by her imagination and that she created these characters and these worlds all in her dreams. She basically invented her own story, and Helen, Alice's sister, finds herself at the end of the story wishing that she had such an active imagination. Both Wonderland and Looking Glass end in basically the same way. Alice realizes that it's all a dream, wakes up, and then goes off to tell her sister and anyone who will listen about her dream. And then Lewis Carroll closes with some point about never losing your imagination. The Disney movie ends in the same way, of course, with Alice waking up, but the point about not losing your imagination isn't emphasized quite as well. She starts to talk about it, but then they just kind of go in for tea. Also, both Wonderland and Looking Glass end with Alice standing up to whatever her adversary is and realizing that it wasn't nearly as big and scary as she thought it was initially. The movie has Alice doing that too, but then she shrinks back down to size and is chased out of Wonderland by the entirety of Wonderland and basically wakes up in a panic rather than on a note of triumph. I think for that reason, I prefer the book version of Alice. She seems to have more of a head on her shoulders and better control over her imagination. But there are a lot of really bizarre characters in both stories to examine, so let's take a look. Where do you even start with this category? Well, let's start with the characters that actually overlap. From Wonderland, you've got the White Rabbit, the Dodo, Bill the Lizard, the Caterpillar, the Cheshire Cat, the Dormouse, the March Hare, and of course, fan favorite, the Mad Hatter.
And a king.
From Through the Looking Glass, we have Tweedledum and Tweedledee, the Walrus and the Carpenter, and the Talking Flowers. And I would argue that Disney's Queen of Hearts is actually a combination of the Queen of Hearts from Wonderland and the Red Queen from the Looking Glass. So she's not only inconsistent, loud, and flighty, but also actually wields some power. Plus, where the book queen never actually beheaded anyone, it all being her fancy, in the movie there's never any indication that the Queen of Hearts didn't actually execute those people. Characters that didn't make the cut include the Duchess's cook, the Duchess's baby/pig, the Griffin, the Mock Turtle, and the Knave from Wonderland, and the White King and Queen, the White Knight, Humpty Dumpty, and the Lion and the Unicorn from Looking Glass, as well as a few other assorted cameos, which quite frankly aren't very interesting. In general, the book-movie crossovers are pretty comparable. I think I like the book White Rabbit a little bit more because he's not just a stereotypical bumbler like he is in the Disney movie. He has a little bit more of a personality besides the I'm late for a very important date trait. Though, granted, he's about as inconsistent as anyone else in the story. The King of Hearts is also a bit more competent in the book, though not by much. The movie just took the fact that he's basically the Queen's lackey to the extreme with his personality, to say nothing of his physical stature. And from The Looking Glass, I actually prefer the original Tweedles to the Disney creation. Don't get me wrong, the movie Tweedles are fun and everything, but I really like the sibling-like argumentative relationship between the original Tweedles. These are the silly brothers who can't agree on anything, and it's quite enjoyable, right up to the battle with the rattle. As far as the movie goes, I absolutely adore the Dodo. In the book, he was almost a throwaway character, but the movie really plays up his bumbling, pompous nature. Both Hatters are pretty much on the same level of silliness, but I think I like the March Hare from the movie more. I don't know, something about him just seems more zany. Maybe it's that look in his eyes. And of course, we can't ignore the Queen of Hearts, who is just as inconsistent and ridiculous as Wonderland's Queen of Hearts, and just as ruthless and power-hungry as Looking Glass's Red Queen. The other characters, as my literary counterpart said, are pretty comparable. Both book and movie present some pretty silly characters with fairly inconsistent personalities, which of course is the point. The question then becomes whether or not the characters in the book that didn't make the cut added anything. I would argue that the Duchess is an amusing foil to the Queen of Hearts, and I kind of wish she had stayed. And the Griffin and Mock Turtle are just fun. I mean, they don't really add much to the story, but to be fair, neither do any of the other characters. And probably the most popular character from Looking Glass, aside from the Tweedles, is the White Knight. He's only in one chapter, but he's such a likable character, constantly falling off his horse and inventing the most silly and useless things, and yet still being gallant, chivalrous, and loyal to whatever cause he happens to be fighting for. A lot of other movie adaptations of Wonderland have added him for that reason, and he definitely adds a lot to the story, even in his brief appearance. As it happens, however, the movie also has a character that it added that wasn't in the book. In the book, Alice goes through the whole drink me and pool of tears scenes alone, and she talks to herself. But in the movie, we actually have a talking doorknob, who has a very enjoyable personality and, in many ways, is Alice's link to reality. At the end, when she's being chased by pretty much everyone in Wonderland, he's the only one who's even remotely helpful by telling her that, hey, it's all a dream.
But you are outside.
What?
See for yourself.
Why, that's me!
And a talking doorknob is definitely consistent with the weirdness of Wonderland. And though this alone might not be quite enough to win this round for the movie, I think the rest of the colorful and dynamic personalities of the characters are. These characters are wildly entertaining in their eccentricities, which is not to say that the book characters aren't, but those characters are often more confusing and rude than they are enjoyable. Also, I really like the interactions between the characters in the movie as these insane personalities clash. It's a close call to be sure, but in the end, I was more entertained by the characters in the movie. But now let's look at two perceptions of two worlds built purely on imagination. Here's imagery. Let's face it, these worlds are messed up. I mean, Cassie's dream about senses and almonds has nothing on these dreams. Unlike a lot of visual adaptations though, Lewis Carroll always made it clear that Wonderland and The Land Behind the Looking Glass were definitely figments of Alice's imagination. In both books, she wakes up at the end and tells everybody about the dream that she had. The worlds are very dreamlike as well. Some chapters are so strange they don't even make any kind of sense. One example is the first scene with the Duchess in Wonderland. You've got two footmen conversing as a frog and a fish, a cook who's making pepper soup and throwing things for no apparent reason, the Duchess who's singing a perfectly awful song to her baby, who then turns into a pig, like you do, and of course, a smiling cat. Looking Glass is the same, although it does have kind of the pseudo-structure of the chess game throughout the thing. But as creative and imaginative as the book imagery is, there's not always a lot of structure to it. Even the chess game from the Looking Glass doesn't totally make sense and ends up being more confusing than interesting. The imagery from the movie is just as creative and weird, but it also has some structure to it. Which maybe isn't what Carol intended, but honestly, if you think about it, this movie is pretty much perfect for Disney animation. With this movie, you get the feeling that they just got a bunch of animators in a room and said, okay, go nuts! And the result is a whole bunch of creative imagery. Take a look at the number of ways to pour tea in the tea party, or the way the smoke forms for the caterpillar, or the way the talking flowers are drawn in the talking flower scene. There is so much going on in this movie, and it's all incredibly detailed, as you would expect from classic Disney animation. Plus, there are a lot of catchy tunes in this movie. Some of them only appear for about a minute, but there are a lot of really memorable songs in this movie, some of them taken directly from the lyrics of the poems that Lewis Carroll wrote. In a world fueled by creativity and imagination, it makes sense for the imagery of the movie to be as creative and imaginative as possible. But what about Wonderland itself? These stories created some very rich and inventive worlds, but which one did it better? First off, we're not just talking about Wonderland here. Lewis Carroll created two distinct worlds, Wonderland and the Land Behind the Looking Glass. Movie versions typically smoosh these two worlds together, but Lewis Carroll treats them as two distinct worlds. The only overlap between them is the fact that the Mad Hatter and the March Hare do actually make a brief cameo in Looking Glass under different names, but even then you can only really tell if you look at the illustrations. Also, the nature of the worlds is slightly different. In the books, the worlds are definitely dreamed up by Alice. Now, the movie Wonderland is a dream as well, as is established at the end, but the book worlds seem more authentically dreamlike. Like that first scene with the Duchess when the baby turns into a pig. Why does the baby turn into a pig? No reason. It's a dream. It happens. The movie's Wonderland definitely has more structure to it, and even though it is also established as a dream, it seems like it could be a real place. Things make a lot more sense and are a little more firmly established. Oddly enough, the Mad Tea Party is probably the craziest thing in the movie, whereas in the book it's one of the few things that actually makes sense. Kind of. I also like that things like the Mome Raths and the Told You Would, which were just figments from the Jabberwocky poem in Looking Glass, are actually given structure and form in the movie. In general, the movie seems to strike a decent balance between dreamlike things and actual structure. But one of the things that the book does is create its own kind of logic. And while Alice notes a number of things that make absolutely no sense, there are also a number of things that make perfect sense to her at the time, but make no sense to the audience. And it's because she's existing in the dream, and so things that don't make sense to us are of course going to make perfect sense to her. In the movie, you never really got the sense that Alice was existing in the dream. She was always on the outside looking in, but in the books, Alice actually starts to lose track of who and what she is as she becomes more and more incorporated in the world of the dream. Also, the movie Wonderland is actually pretty hostile. I mean, there are hostile characters in the book too, but by the end of the movie, everyone is out to get Alice. And as I said before, Alice never really confronts the dream head on. When she realizes that she's dreaming in the books, the dreams are no longer threatening. But in the movie, the dream continues to chase her. The result being that you don't really get the feeling that Alice is the poster child for imagination like you do in the books. It's more like, wow, thank heaven that was all a dream, back to reality, as opposed to, wow, what a strange dream, let me tell you all about it. For that reason, I think the book has the better and more authentically dreamlike lands. As usual, it all comes down to story, incoherent though it may be. Now, neither of these plots is that coherent. That wasn't really the point of the story, after all. This is supposed to be completely nonsensical, foolish, and inconsistent because it comes right out of the imagination of a child. The movie is a little more coherent, but it still maintains that sense of nonsense that is inherent of Wonderland. The books really read more like a series of short stories, linked together through the fact that they take place in Wonderland or in the land through the Looking Glass. And the stories range from being completely nonsensical, like the first scene with the Duchess, to almost sort of, but not really making sense, like the Mad Tea Party or the Jabberwocky. It's unbridled imagination, and because of this, the message at the end is a lot stronger. In both books, Alice realizes it's all a dream, wakes up, and goes to tell someone all about it. And in Wonderland, Helen, Alice's sister, thinks about how imaginative her little sister is and wishes that she could have that same childlike imagination. In the movie, this message isn't nearly as strong. Alice is essentially chased out of the dream and doesn't get a chance to tell Helen any more than the caterpillar said. But while the first book might authentically create the whimsy of a child's imagination, the second book is a little confused. We still see that unstructured imagination, but it also has kind of the pseudo-structure of a chess game. Kind of. And it's interesting in a way, but it's one of those things that doesn't really work because it feels like there should be a point, and there isn't. Also, Looking Glass just drags at times. The scenes with the Tweedles and the White Knight and the Jabberwocky are fun, but most of the other scenes just aren't that interesting. In general, they rely too much on wordplay and not enough on creative imagery. The characters seem less likable too, either being extremely rude or too easily offended. But there are a lot of elements from the Looking Glass story that have become just as iconic as the Wonderland elements. You've got the Jabberwocky, of course, which a lot of school children still have to memorize. The concept of an unbirthday, which the Tea Party sings about in the movie, comes from Looking Glass. And of course there's the idea of traveling through the Looking Glass itself and traveling to an alternate and backwards universe, which is an idea that has been used in several stories since. Everything from several episodes of Star Trek to an episode of the children's cartoon Rugrats. Though the main story itself might not be memorable, plenty of imaginative elements from that story are. But the movie has also given us a number of iconic elements, most of them from the songs like I'm late for a very important date, or A Very Merry Unbirthday, but also in the fact that Alice has kind of become a staple for Disney's themes of imagination and wonder. I mean, one of the most well-known rides at Disneyland is the spinning teacups from the Mad Tea Party. But just like with The Christmas Carol, the book inspired all those elements and they would not exist without the message of the books. Alice isn't just a staple of Disney. Just about everyone has done something that was inspired by an Alice story. The adaptations are everywhere you look. But unlike The Christmas Carol, only one of those adaptations really stands out, and it's this movie. The others are mostly miniseries and made-for-television movies that haven't made nearly the dent on our culture that this movie has. And just like The Wizard of Oz, it's worth asking whether or not the popularity of this story is tribute to the book itself or the presence of the Disney movie. And all you have to do is look at how many well-known elements are from the books that weren't used in the movie to see that all you have to do is look at how many forgettable aspects there are in both books that no one remembers. Different levels of imagination, a point that your precious book is kind of twice and over. Exactly the same way for no apparent reason. I mean, what was the point of even writing the second book? It's not just going to make the exact same point as the first. What? Don't worry. I got this. What the hell is he doing? I don't know. So yeah, I'm conducting this poll to see what the denizens of Wonderland prefer, the book or the movie, and I was wondering if you had any thoughts. Okay, I'm about to conduct an interview with the talking flowers from Through the Looking Glass, so we'll see what they have to say. Turns out I'm allergic to talking flowers too. I'm getting a very interesting point of view from this croquet mallet. Tell them what you have to say. Whoa. Easy. I think the interview's over. Okay, I had an appointment with the White Rabbit. I'm in his house. He doesn't seem to be home. I think he's forgotten. He has a lot of reminders laying around, though.
Sound good?
Excuse me, I'm conducting an interview
What are you doing, Matthew? What are you doing here?
I'm the Scottish reviewer. I'm doing a review.
Wait, you have a theater reviewing persona now? Excuse me, I have a theater degree.
Thank you for your time.
Matthew?
All right, on to the next person. All right, I've got some sad news for fans of The Caterpillar. I unfortunately was not able to secure an interview with him. He's a very busy bug after all. However, I was able to secure an interview with a living creature who is very, very close to The Caterpillar. So let's see what he has to say. So what do you think about Alice in Wonderland, the book versus the movie? I see. Okay guys, this is huge. This is really, really big. I have secured an interview with the Jabberwocky.
Number 2.
No comment. Well, Your Majesty, I do appreciate you letting me into your kingdom to interview your people, but I'm afraid that your interview is just going to have to be invalidated because, well, you're nothing but a pack of cards. There. All right, Matt, Hatter, I have been to Wonderland, and I have taken a poll of the denizens there about whether they prefer the book or the movie, and we can now decide definitively which one is better. And it's a tie. Oh, come on! We can't have a tie! We have to make a decision! Well, yeah. Let me take a crack at this. Matt, if we were comparing the Disney movie to Alice's Adventures in Wonderland only, then book would definitely win. However, we're comparing it to Wonderland and Looking Glass, and that changes things. Because the fact is that visual adaptations of these stories usually stick to the Wonderland framework and incorporate elements of Looking Glass, and there's a reason. Wonderland has the stronger story, even though there are a lot of elements from Looking Glass that work. There's also the fact that other than these few elements, the Looking Glass story is pretty much redundant as it makes the exact same point and in pretty much the exact same way as Wonderland. So in that way, the Disney movie, which takes those elements of Looking Glass that are stronger and smooshes them together with the framework of the Wonderland story, has the right idea. Are there elements of the books that are better than the movie? Yes. Is the message of the book stronger? Absolutely. But as a whole, the movie tells a stronger and more satisfying story than the combination of the two books. Whatever. Fine. And that does it for another Books vs. Movies review. Glad I could help to mediate the tiebreaker, and you know, this is kind of fun. I think I should help out with more Books vs. Movies reviews. Well, anyway, the next Books vs. Movies review is going to be the 20th, and so you can be sure that it's going to be some... What happened to him? Don't know. Don't care. Let's go get Jimmy John's.